Thank you everyone for joining us here at the Fieldhouse Museum and online. We are so happy to have both in-person and virtual guests. James Masters, who is our presenter today, has been into the history, mathematics, strategy, and camaraderie, rules, and even the playing of games since early childhood. It's great that he gets to do it up into adulthood too. Not many of us get that. So his interests tend to whirl around pub games, table games, ancient board games, and how games of all sorts evolve over time. Author of the online guide to traditional games website and maintainer of the games research database. Most recently, he has completed a paper on the medieval sport of logettes. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, that's logettes. Yeah.
And an article on the ancient Egyptian game of Mehen.
Mehen. Yep, that's pretty much it.
Good. After James gives his presentation today, we will open up for comments. Feel free to leave them in the chat box for those of you joining us virtually as we go, and we can get to them at the end. So without further ado, I give you James Masters.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. And thank you for letting me do this talk, because I've been collecting bagatelles and being very interested in it for a long time, but have never really had the chance to sort of research them properly. And this spurred me into doing some proper digging into the history of it. And I think I've found some quite interesting things. So hopefully you'll get to see them and agree. Let me first try and share my screen. So let's just start off with the basics, because I can't be sure that everyone even knows what bagatelle is to begin with. So we'll work out how to continue. There we go. So what is bagatelle? The word bagatelle means a trifle or something trivial. And so that presumably is what the game is named after for some point in the past. I thought we'd go for some really basic sources for information. So I started with Google and decided to see what that would tell us. So it's a game in which small balls are hit and then allowed to roll down a sloping board on which there are holes, each numbered with a score achieved if a ball goes into it, with pins acting as obstructions. So hopefully most people are familiar with that kind of game. Even if you haven't seen Bagatelle, you've probably seen pinball, which is an evolution from Bagatelle. And this is the classic tabletop game that a lot of people saw when they were young, and I had one. Loads of people my age would have had one. These days, possibly not so much with the advent of video games. And if you look at the board, you can see there's a plunger on the right with a spring that propels the ball up and around and into the playing field, where it can get captured. It bounces off the top left pin first and then bounces into the playing field and makes its way down to the bottom. If it reaches the bottom, you score nothing. Otherwise, you score whatever's on the holes or in the receptacles formed by the pins. There's only one special receptacle on most boards, which is the one in the bottom left. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor. I'm hoping you can. And that is the one formed with 3 pins in a triangle there. If it goes in there, then any dead balls that have already been played, you get to replay again. On some later forms of the board, including this one, on the right-hand side opposite, there's one formed of 4 pins. And if the ball lands in there, it's bad news, the game is over. So that's quite a typical layout for a tabletop bagatelle game. So now I thought we'd try Wikipedia. Now, Wikipedia tells us that it's quite an old game. In 1777, a party was thrown in honour of Louis the 16th and the Queen at the Chateau de Bagatelle. So the upshot of this is that there's a story that the game of Bagatelle was pretty much invented in the Chateau de Bagatelle at this party, or first revealed at this party, and it then thereafter became hugely popular in France. And there you go. That's the common story, but from what I can see, it's a little bit dubious. We'll come back to that later. However, there are old bagatelles, and they are usually rather bigger and more grand than the one I was just showing you. This is a nice example. It's a French table from the mid 1800s. And as you can see, it's got arches and pins. It's fundamentally the same sort of game, but there are differences. So you can do a quick comparison. The tabletop one is put on a table, whereas the other one's freestanding. The one on the left's got a plunger, whereas on the older games, you tended to play them with a cue or a mace, which is like a pusher. The one on the left's got the dead ball area I mentioned, whereas you can see the one on the right has, instead of nothing there's a scoring margin. So even if your ball misses everything else, it still gets to score. The game on the right's got 2 channels, one either side to launch the ball from. The one on the left has got 1. And the one on the right has arches and cups, whereas the one on the left has cups and pins. The arches seem to have fallen out of favour at some point. The one on the left is more like a toy. It was kind of, you'd find it in toy shops and it would be marketed for children. Whereas in the old days, most games were more for adults, and certainly this was, and they would gamble on it as well. Okay, so then I thought we'd go to a more authoritative source possibly. And so the Oxford English Dictionary tells us that it's a game played on a table having a semicircular end at which are 9 holes. The ball's used to strike from the opposite end of the board with a cue. So there may be a question mark in your mind now, because that doesn't sound quite like what we've just been looking at. And lo, this game is also Bagatelle. So this is my table. It's an 8-foot slate bed Bagatelle table. It's the same sort of ilk as a snooker table or pool table. It's a serious bit of kit. It's got the 9 cups in a ring at the end. Each one scores a different amount. And I've got a video which I'm now about to attempt to play. We'll see how this goes. And explaining how to play the game.
To play 9-cup Bagatelle, you need 8 white balls and a black ball and a Bagatelle table with 9 cups. The middle cup is worth 9, the left-hand cup is worth 8, and the right-hand cup is worth 7. And the other 6 cups are 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1 is at the front, so there's no point going for that one. Each ball successfully potted counts the number in the cup, and the black ball counts double, so it's obviously a good idea to try and get the black ball in one of the higher cups, preferably the 9, but that's quite difficult. So very often the first shot one undertakes is to try to get the black ball in one of the side pockets. Almost like that. If it doesn't work, each new ball has to hit the black ball, and with any luck, it'll pot the black ball, and possibly one of the whites as well. And so on you go, keeping with the white balls. When the black ball's down, you then have to hit any other white ball. If there are no available white balls to hit, you have to just hit a cushion. And this is often the way it goes, because the interesting thing about Bagatelle is it's extremely hard. And the angles are very different to a billiards table, and they take a bit of getting used to. And the last one.
It takes 4 people to lift that table, and it's not even easy with 4 people. It's really, really heavy. But there were even larger tables. I came across an advert for one measuring 12 feet by 4 foot, and apparently it weighed half a ton. So another little comparison, we can compare sort of pin Bagatelle, what most people think of as Bagatelle these days, with the old 9-cup Bagatelle. So one is tilted, the other one's level. One, you've got the plunger, whereas as you saw, you play 9-cup Bagatelle with cues. One is pretty lucky, as most of the game is, there's a little bit of skill, but I think it's probably 70% luck and 30% skill, whereas Bagatelle is purely a game of skill. And again, it's sort of a large game targeted towards adults. The game is still played. The last remaining pub league is north of Wales. I'm just struggling to remember the name of the town, but there's one town there where there's still a thriving league. They've got a number of pubs there, and it's quite successful. Other than that, it's almost died out, unfortunately. However, as if that wasn't complicated enough, modern bagatelles, there are dozens of different varieties and styles and designs. There's just a couple to whet your appetite. There's another game called Japanese Rolling Ball. A friend of mine called Caitlin is on this call, is a specialist in this and has written some pieces on it. But fundamentally, it's a similar kind of game to 9-cut bagatelle, but you roll the balls with your hands. This apparently is extremely popular in America and Japan, early 20th century. This is bar billiards, a familiar sight for people who are my age have been in a few pubs. Not as popular as it once was, but you do still see them. There's one in my town here, St Albans, in a pub. Similar kind of game. You have to knock the balls into the holes, except in this case, the holes will run back to the front and then you can keep going. But you have to avoid knocking over the skittles as you do it. This game is supposedly from Belgium, sort of Western Europe, derived from that, but I don't think it's much older than 1930. Here's another game similar. This is actually a circular bagatelle game, effectively a circular version of the game we just saw on the video. You use the mace there to rush the ball around the edge, and then you direct it with this triangular wedge-shaped piece at the bottom, which is on a hinge, and you try to get it into the cups in the same way. And then a lot of the 9-cut bagatelles also have this interesting arch board as an additional thing, and you can play different games with that. You can play, it's usually called Mississippi when it's like that. And so there's clearly a link with Mississippi, or True Madame as it's often known, and 9-cut bagatelle. And going back to America, they seem to be quite popular in sort of late 1800s onwards. The pigeonhole table, as it was called, or Jenny Lind is another name. There were lots of these tables appearing, but it does go back even further than that, as I'll show you later. Here's another complication, just to add to the confusion. This is like a 9-cut bagatelle, and it's got a True Madame arch, and it's got pins and cups at the back there. So make of that what you will. Another one, I think Caitlin gave me this picture as well. It's Carambolette is what it's called. A lot of these games are kind of branded or manufactured by particular companies at the time who were trying to promote their thing. And I imagine this is just an invention from one of those companies that kind of got popular. This company that made this particular version was Brunswick and Bulk. Okay, so it's all quite confusing. There's hundreds of different variations. There's at least 3 types from an early time, and not many people have done much research into the game to try and sort of work it all out. So that's what I've been trying to do, and hopefully I've disentangled it quite well. So the first thing to note is that most of those variations you just saw that I was showing you to boggle at are fairly modern. The older games are really the 9-cut bagatelle and the larger old pin bagatelle. And the True Madame link, well, True Madame is the oldest of all the games. It goes back much earlier. So that's still worth looking at. The rest of them are all derivatives, effectively. There's a few things, I think you'll find most of this on Wikipedia and in some encyclopedias that state that bagatelle is some kind of evolution from the game of skittles, because there's a ball and there's 9 things to aim at, I guess, but I've never seen any evidence for that. I think that's just a bit of a specious claim. And the game of skittles is actually quite different to the game of bagatelle in many ways. There's probably less common than there is different. There's not really any evidence that it evolved from billiards either, which is sometimes a claim made. although clearly a lot of the manufacturing and the table and the equipment, there was a lot of overlap. So as the mace developed into the cue, that was happening for both billiards and for bagatelle at the same time. You know, the cushions, that was a technology that was happening over time during the 1800s, that would have developed on both tables. So that kind of thing, there is clearly a link, but I don't think bagatelle is derived from billiards intrinsically. And although I did love this theory at one point and have not yet ruled it out completely, it's quite possible that it wasn't a development from the old game of 9 holes, which is exemplified brilliantly in this old French book. So you can see the frightening looking cherub things are playing a game of fossette, where they chuck a ball into the ground. There's 9 holes. And to all intents and purposes, that looks very much like a similar kind of game, but just played on the ground. So you could imagine that bagatelle might have evolved from that. And it's possible it did, but there's no evidence for sure. And actually, if you look into the description of the rules of the game in the 1700s and 1800s, you can dig out books that actually explain how to play some of these games. Mostly they describe a quite different game where each player had a number in one of the holes. They chucked the ball in, and if their number was the hole that the ball went into, they then had to be chased by all the others. It was more like a game of tag and not like a game of bagatelle at all. That's a far more common description of the game. I've never really seen a direct description of the game that says the balls were thrown into holes with numbers and scored like that. So that is a bit outstanding. So what do we really know? And this is what I've been trying to research over the last 2 or 3 months. So what I usually try and do in these situations is search for the earliest references you can find for any kind of term involved with the game. So clearly the first thing to search for is bagatelle. And the oldest historical dictionary is the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, from whence you get the earliest quote is 1819, which is, I think it was an advert by Thurston, the famous billiards manufacturer, who are advertising themselves as a billiard table and bagatelle manufacturer. Now, I have found something earlier than the OED found. In the Leicester Journal, 1812, there's a list of items, and one of them is a bagatelle, or a trio of bagatelle tables with balls and maces. So that's the earliest direct reference to bagatelle in England. However, Caitlin has done a bit of research for me as well on the side, because I just didn't have time, and she's really good at this stuff. And she found 2 from 1819 in America. So that's the earliest we've yet found from America. At this time, fashion and games in America tended to be slightly behind the UK, but that was quickly changing. By the end of the 1900s, very often the Americans were doing more to develop games, and the UK started to follow. Here's a classic cartoon that often comes up in terms of bagatelle. It's a political cartoon. But it's 1864, and you can see the whole thing is based around a game of bagatelle. And yeah. Okay, so if you carry on that kind of line, you see that all the term bagatelle that you can find from about 1810 to 1870, it all refers to 9-cut bagatelle. Bagatelle didn't seem to mean the game, the more modern pin bagatelle at all at this time. So if there was that game around at that time, then it wasn't called bagatelle, it was called something else. And the game seemed pretty popular, 9-cut bagatelle, throughout the whole of the 1800s. It lasted well into the 1900s. And you can see that from all sorts of references to it. Here's a couple I've got. 1822, the alehouse hack. The government actually banned it, or banned gaming with it in a pub. And then Charles Dickens mentions it in the Pickwick Papers, 1836. And in both America and Britain, it was very popular for a long time. So, given that France is supposedly the source of the game of Bagatelle. What do we get if we search in France for the term Bagatelle? Well, you get virtually nothing until nearing the 20th century. There's a book called Académie des Jeux, University of Games, if you like, that's just like Hoyle's Games, if you know that. So in Britain, America, Hoyle's Games is the classic book that gives you all the rules of games, mostly card games, but also other games like Bagatelle and numerous games, and all sorts of publishers brought it out. It was ripped off left, right and centre. And Académie des Jeux is exactly the same thing in France. And so you would expect it to have the game in if that game existed. But it's I asked a French colleague to search. He said there's nothing in there before the 19th century, and doesn't seem to be anything in there at all, basically. So this should be raising question marks in everyone's minds, because Wikipedia told us that Bagatelle is named after the Chateau de Bagatelle, and the game was extremely popular shortly after 1777, where it was first exposed to the world. So I'm doing time. Okay. So clearly this legend needs looking into. So I've been spent quite some time trying to find any reference to the Chateau de Bagatelle and link it to a game. And well, I failed. Currently I doubt that it exists, and I don't think it's true, but I haven't completely finished all my searches yet, so I'm not going to state that definitely yet. So I'm not sure if you can see the screen, but this is one of the most authoritative works on pinball. It's by Richard M. Bushell, and most every reference that I can find all traces back to this book, where he does come up with the idea that the game was revealed first at this party. He doesn't assert it as absolute fact, but he makes it, it almost says that, and pretty much everyone else since has taken that up as fact, from what I can see. So I looked into the references there, and there's two really. One is from a book called Bagatelle, ses jardins et ses roses, however you pronounce that. My French is not good. And there was no mention of any game there at all. I got that book. And then there's several references to The Nation, periodical of the time. And there is a reference in there. And the only reference says he kept a gaming table in his own house. Now that could be interpreted as a game table, which you then might assume could be Bagatelle. But actually, a gaming table doesn't mean that normally. What the term gaming table tends to mean a table where you gambled cards or dice. It just means he had people round and they gambled. There's no indication there that there's any game table of any sort like Bagatelle. I've also checked the biggest and most extensive volume on Le Chateau de Bagatelle. I've translated quite large passages of it to find anything to do with games. Absolutely nothing that I could find. So there's a term for this. It's called a factoid. So it seems difficult to believe that all these encyclopedias and Wikipedia and everything is stating that Bagatelle comes from the legend of Chateau Bagatelle. It's a great story. Marie Antoinette apparently had a bet with the Comte d'Artois, and he said he would build her this house in 7 weeks for the party that they planned, and he put 900 workers on it, massive amounts of money, achieved this goal through the party, and there was apparently this games table there. Everything about that is probably true, apart from the games table. There are other examples of factoid in games history as well. My favourite one is Skittles goes back to Egyptian times. So Skittles is Egyptian. You'll read it all over the place if you look it up. And this all goes back to a single entry in a report by Flinders Petrie, the eminent archaeologist. He was persuaded by a friend that 9 little game pieces and 3 little marbles he found were miniature set of Skittles in a grave. So he wrote that in his report, and it's just utter trollop. It's not true at all. Skittles isn't seen again for 4,000 years, and it doesn't look like that anyway, and a game that size doesn't work. So That's another example of a factoid. They can come from single references and be blown out of all proportion. I suspect that's what's happened with the Chateau de Bagatelle story, but it's not yet proven. There are tables in France. Here's a beautiful looking table, which is in the Chateau de Compiègne. It was installed around 1862. There's a couple of others, I think, as well, around, and they were sort of stem from around the same time. Nothing earlier than 1850s, really. But I have found 3 or 4 more books in French, and interpreting them takes me a great amount of time, and I have not yet had time, so that's still work in progress. I've got to translate a lot of paragraphs. If anyone's interested to know what I find, ping me an email after this, and I can tell anyone if I have to eat my words. So, is there anything older than 1800 for Bagatelle? Any evidence whatsoever? Well, there's a couple of things. This one is a possibility. So it's a table, a fantastically beautiful looking table that the Museum of German History in Berlin hold. You can see it's a multi-games table. It's got 3 different games in it, and one of them is a Bagatelle type game, a pin Bagatelle type game. That's a slightly better picture. I've not been able to obtain any better pictures, unfortunately. So I emailed them, had a bit of a confab with them, and Wolfgang Korjanes of the museum, he seemed to be an expert, and he estimated the date is based on style and materials 1770 to 1790. So there's no provenance for the table, and that's his estimate. You know, one couldn't say that's not true, but there's not really much evidence of pin Bagatelle back to that time, so it's not really clear. That one is just up in the air, unfortunately. And there are cups on that table, which seems a bit unlikely for a table of that age. However, there is some certainty, because Joseph Strutt, I don't know if you can see my screen again. This is Strutt's Sports and Pastimes of the People of England. It's a famous book in games, in the gaming history world. It's one of the best volumes on games. He published it in 1801. There he is. And there's all manner of stuff in there that's not anywhere else and is really useful. And there's one short paragraph where he describes a game called The Rocks of Scilly. And he says it features a single chute pushed with a battoon of wood, curved at the top, and arches and pins in the playfield. So the description of the game is clearly pin Bagatelle. And so The Rocks of Scilly appears to be the name or a name that game went by in that time. And bear in mind that he published it in 1801, but he was researching it for a good decade before that. So we can be pretty sure it was around in the 1790s. But the actual earliest certain reference we've got so far found is in America, from America. I found this book called The Early Republic and the Sea, if I can get it in front of the camera. It's a bunch of essays on the naval and maritime history of the early United States. And in it, one of the essays is called Daniel Corkin's Voyage, an Incident of Quasi-War. And it's got all sorts of journal entries from Corkin. And the journal entry in 2nd of August 1799, when he was in New York, he said, "Last evening, Captain E. Lee, his brother George and myself went to a tavern and played a game called The Rocks of Scilly. We played it for a mug of beer. I lost it." So I believe that's probably the earliest certain reference we have to the game of Bagatelle. So more detail on Strutt's reference is quite interesting, because it links the game of True Madame irrevocably to Bagatelle. So shall I just read this out? There are arches similar to those upon the Mississippi table and numbered in like manner, but it is frequently interrupted in its descent by wires inserted upon the table. The game is reckoned in the same manner as at Mississippi. The first to 120 wins. So I think one can conclude from that that a Bagatelle table at this time was effectively a Mississippi turned around and tilted, because you've got the same scoring mechanism, you've got the same arches, you've got a ball being fired one at a time. And the only difference really is the ball is going up and then coming back down, and they've added a bit of interest with the pins. So as far as I'm concerned, the original Bagatelle was True Madame, a version of True Madame, an evolution of it, if you like, which is neat and interesting. So True Madame, a little bit of history on that. This is a table dated around 1775 in Abbot Hall in Kendal, which is up in the north of England in Cumbria. And you can see there's a mace there, not a cue, but effectively you shove balls down and try to get them through the arches. In some versions of the game, the later ones where there's a cue and it's more skillful and so easier to get it straight in the hole, you have to bounce the ball off the cushion or the edge of the table before it goes into the hole. Here's an older one, back to 1630 now, an engraving. And in this version, they're clearly not bothering with a mace or a cue, they're just rolling it straight in with their hand. And we can go back further. So back before climate change, there were frost fairs every so often on the Thames. The Thames used to freeze over every few years. And when it did, there was a massive party and everyone got out fair games, and it was eating and a bit of a fair. You can see this is a picture of the Thames. There's London Bridge on the left with the houses, the old London Bridge before it was removed, with the shops and houses on it. And in the bottom right, you can see a chap throwing a ball at some arches on the ground. So True Madame could be played on the ground as well. And then we can go back even further to the 1500s. This is a couple of quotes. This is from Bath Buckstone, 1572. There's a description of the game of Bagatelle. It seems like it's been put into the side of a bench. I don't know if that means it's on the ground or not, but they were certainly playing it then. In 1571, a letter from Claude de France, daughter of Henry II, said, "Please send us a pool game and another game called True Madame." When she says pool game, she's not talking about 9-ball pool or 8-ball pool. She's talking about some kind of gambling game. So True Madame evolved sort of late 1700s into Pin Bagatelle, and around 1910, 9-hole Bagatelle appeared as if by magic out of the blue. Whether it didn't seem to be related to Pin Bagatelle, but obviously there's some link along the way. So when did the sort of modern tabletop form of the game start? Well, having looked through quite a lot of books, the earliest form of the game, something that looks like modern Pin Bagatelle, is this game called Cockamaroo, or Russian Bagatelle, or sometimes German billiards. It looks very similar, and it is, but the game is a different one. I wonder if I can show you. Yeah, so this is a game I took only about a picture I took only a couple of hours ago. So in this game, you didn't fire a bunch of balls up and then just see how much they scored. It's quite different. You put your red ball at the top, and that's where it started. So you can already see there's a resemblance to 9-cut Bagatelle, because that's the equivalent of the black. And then you pushed your white ball and tried to get it into the field, and that scored the points that you got. Or if it dislodges the red ball, then you get double points for the red ball too. So the opponent then had his own white ball, or her own white ball, and would fire it up as well. And you actually made a break. You kept scoring, or you kept playing until you stopped scoring. So this is not the same as modern Pin Bagatelle at all. It's a combination. It's like the offspring of 9-cut Bagatelle and Pin Bagatelle, making a new game called Cockamaroo. And if you ever want to know whether a Pin Bagatelle you're looking at is a normal Pin Bagatelle or this Cockamaroo German billiards form of the game, Well, you'll see a dot at the top where or a little dimple or an indentation where the king ball or the red ball is supposed to be put at the start of the game. So that's how you tell. German billiards is a pretty similar game, but in that game you do fire multiple balls round, but there's still that extra ball at the top. So this game is in loads of games books right through from the mid 1850s to 1900. It was clearly pretty popular, but it's an interesting example of a game that was hugely popular for a while and then has disappeared out of all human consciousness still. No one I know would recognize this as a specific game or different to a Bagatelle, apart from possibly two other Bagatelle nerds that I happen to know. But this, you know, it's just a dead game now. So in America, things were taking their own course. There's a guy called Montague Redgrave came from England and he patented the plunger. It's very unlikely he invented it, but he patented it. And that's the earliest known reference I have for the term bagatelle being used for pin bagatelle is by him. This is the little sort of patent model that he made to go with his patent application, which is quite sweet. And then these are games he subsequently started to manufacture. The one on the left is one that I have, and it is the first sort of production pin bagatelle that he made. However, if you are concentrating, you will notice there's an interesting thing at the top there. Right at the top, there's a little dimple. So the first production bagatelle that Redgrave made was not pin bagatelle at all. It was a type of cockamaroo, which is interesting because it means that possibly pin bagatelle evolved from cockamaroo and not went directly right through from the older game. That's unclear at the moment. So what we have is True Madame is an old game. It turned into a tilted version of True Madame around 1800 or a bit before. Possible it came around in France or Germany, but there's no certain evidence for that. So the earliest reference we have is 1799 in New York. 1812, the 9-cup bagatelle surfaced. 1850s, tilted tables like cockamaroo and German billiards appear in English literature, and they have quite different rules to the game, as I just explained. 1871, Redgrave patented the bagatelle plunger. And then moving on, the game then, particularly in America, people got very inventive, all manner of different forms of the game and, you know, convergences and overlaps and merging of different styles that turned up. And this all seemed to culminate in the 1920s and 1930s when the tabletop bagatelle had a bit of a fad, effectively, and it got extremely popular. In England, there was a company called Corinthian, and they had an enormous success in the 1930s, manufacturing all manner of all variants of sizes and expensive, different expense boards. And in America, the company Lindstrom seems to be the equivalent. They were manufacturing madly, and it was extremely popular. And then, of course, thereafter, as you can imagine, a series of developments led to pinball in the end. So we had glass tops appeared, coin-op versions of the game. Eventually, it got electrified. And then, critically, in 1947, the flipper was invented. And then pinball sort of grew and became another fad in the 1970s until video games knocked it off its perch. So we've got a little evolutionary tree. We've got True Madame going to Rocks of Scilly, and then 9-cup bagatelle turning up. And then the two got together and produced a daughter, Cockamaroo, from that. Or possibly directly from Rocks of Scilly, we got Pin Bagatelle, which evolved and changed over the years and gradually became more of an arcade game and turned into pinball, which is nice. So I'm not sure what I'm doing for time. 20, okay, it's pretty good. So we're on track. So I thought that's kind of the end of the historical talk. I hope that wasn't too dry for people. But there's a lot of new stuff there that hasn't really, that is certainly not in any textbooks or has been found by anybody else that's been published anyway. So I hope that new reveal was interesting people. I thought I'd go on and finish with some example Bagatelles, because the collection you have in the museum seems to have some great ones. So I thought I'd pick out some interesting Bagatelle. I used to play this for hours. I was a pretty sad child. I used to play lots of games for hours by myself. Yeah, so it's one of my favorites just for that reason, really. So here's a couple of great Bagatelles from Lindstrom and Corinthian, the manufacturer I was just mentioning there. The one on the left is a Corinthian 21.5 or 27.5, I think. I'd done a video for this, but I didn't have time, unfortunately. It's quite difficult to picture. I started and it was too difficult. But there's a few interesting things about it. At the top, there's a handle you can pull, and all the balls that have been fallen into the holes fall into inside the table and line up. And then there's a wheel on the right. You move the wheel and the ball pops into the channel, all ready to be played automatically. And you just move that wheel backwards and forwards each time you do, the wheel goes. It's got two forms of scoring, because at the time this came out, Corinthian had decided to change their scoring, so they gave two versions of it. It's a nice game to play. It feels beautiful. The plunger feels great, and the pins bounce nicely around it. And it was pretty much their premium board at the time. Lindstrom, this is a good example of a Lindstrom, because they seem to specialize in this design with the two wheels. So the ball would shoot out of the tube, come around the bottom, and then shoot into the top circle, where it could end up in either one of the top or the bottom receptacles. They're often made of metal, those ones. Here's some older Bagatelles, but they're not Bagatelles. They're both Cockamoos, because you can see they've got the little dimple at the top where the ball would have been put to try and be knocked out for double points. These have got bells, which is always a nice feature. That one on the right there is from given to me by my friend Richard Ballum, who had the most monstrous collection of games you've ever seen. It filled most of his house, which was a very large house. This is my sort of grandest pin Bagatelle, if you like. I can't quite decide if this one is a Cockamoo or not. I think it is, because that hole at the top is smaller than the other holes and doesn't have a number, but it's still a cup, which seems a bit odd. It's about it's more than 3 feet long. And it's big and quite beautiful. So this is the Wizen Pin game. I run a game shop, and sometimes we play games. This has been our favorite one to play at work, because it's such a pleasure to play. And I've got a little video that I can try and demonstrate that with. May not play all of this. So it's beautifully engineered, and it has fantastic springs. Most the springs have just a pin. It's often a hardened pin to make it more springy, the first one that is hit. But in this case, they've used a proper piece of sprung metal, and it works so much better. And there are others of those sprung metals in other places around the table. And the thing about this game is it's more skillful than most, because you do try and get it into that middle channel. Every time you get it into the middle channel, you get more points. Effectively, each ball releases higher points available to you. So if you go to the hole at the bottom, then the ball just goes back for a replay. And the dead area is that horizontal channel at the bottom. Hopefully, I think we're about to see. Oh, that's a free one. Oh, that's the end. Sorry about that. But yeah, anyway, it's a pleasure to play that one. This is a circular bagatelle. This is another one of my favourites because it's such a clever idea. You think it's going to be like a normal bagatelle, but the video will demonstrate much better than my words. So the dead area is the red circle in the middle. And it's all beautifully made so that everything tilts towards the center. Great game, that one. And then some fun bagatelles. So there was certainly a trend from the 1950s onwards to make sporty versions of bagatelle. So there's Soccertelle, Snookertelle. There's one based on boxing. There's Cricketelle. All good fun. They're not terribly interesting to play, this kind of game, I have to say, but they look good. Show jumping bagatelle. There are dozens more. This is my favorite one of them. This is a game based on snooker. It's called Pin Snooker. It's been restored, so unfortunately the name was removed in the restoration, but the guy who did it did an amazing job. And so you fire your first ball in, and what you're trying to do is get it down this middle channel here. And that's the equivalent of potting a red in snooker, which is usually a goal to begin with. And then the ball ends up in one of these two channels on the right or left. And then you hit it again to try and pot a colour. And you pot the colour if it ends up going into one of the receptacles. And then, of course, it's snooker. So if you succeed, then you'd go with another turn and continue your break. And you've got your snooker scoreboard at the bottom. Fantastic. One on the left there is just a fun animal game. Each time you get a ball into one of the holes behind the animals, it pops the animal up. So that's good fun. On the right there, we've got a K's of London game, which is just they were a reasonably big manufacturer in the, I think, probably 1960s, 70s. But someone arty has decided to paint it with an Easter Island statue scene, which is rather creative. Looks good on your wall. Here's some more interesting ones. So the one on the left there, that's a Corinthian, in which you can move the central part around during the game to vary it. Silver arrow version of the game there. And on the right here, not quite sure, never looked into this, but I presume the objective is to get the ball through the middle and make those stars turn, in which case you're going to get points depending on which where the pointed star ends up pointing to. Okay, there's my original red grey bagatelle on the left, and it's surprisingly small. It's only about 20 inches long as it goes. And here are some 9-cut bagatelles. That's a folding bagatelle, very typical in Victorian times. They would fold it up and put it away. It's a sort of home version of the game, if you like. That's an even smaller home version of the game. That's just 3 foot. So the one on the left, I think I mentioned, was 10 foot. The one on the right, 7 foot. Then within the 3 foot, we've got a 1 foot bagatelle as well. And this is one of my treasures. It's a chess table. Turn the top over, and inside is the circular bagatelle you saw earlier. And this was shown at the Great Exhibition of 1851, this table. It's got a patent number by Wilson, the company that made bagatelle and billiard tables at the time. And yeah, it's a rather wonderful piece of furniture. And that is the end. So I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Feel free to fire away.
We've had some comments. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So we've had some comments throughout the presentation, which thank you very much for. I think I learned a lot about bagatelle, even though we have an exhibit here at the museum. So, but we will open up 2 questions if anybody has any that they would like to ask online or here at the museum. One of them that I was given was why do you think that pinball remains a popular game today, both in the physical form and in video games?
Well, just because it's a great game. So the thing you see in evolution of games, and this goes right back to ancient times, is that when a game is boring, it doesn't last long. If it keeps going, it means that it's popular and there's nothing else better. So it's obviously a need for people. Video games did stomp on it a bit in the 1980s, and it reduced in popularity, pinball, but it has staying power. It's provenly, a game that people still like to play. And possibly in this era of video games, it's sometimes nice to be able to do something a bit more physical, isn't it? So I would imagine that's kind of behind the popularity.
We have a gentleman, Ethan, who asked, what would be the best way to share resources with you in continuing to research this topic? You got like 5 Bagatelle researchers here that want to open that dialogue. So,
well, I haven't got a forum for discussion, although we could make one. There's not really been that many people interested in Bagatelle until now, so that's great. I would think, I mean, Caitlin in Ottawa, we've been communicating a lot over the last few months. So we have a sort of nub of a start of a group of interested people. I've got a few other people who've contacted me in the past. We could certainly, probably the best way is to email to begin with, and then we'll see what we can set up if other people want to, continue and help research more. So my email is james@masters.me.uk, and you're welcome to email me about anything to do with Bagatelle or games.
Or could they contact you on your website as well?
They can. So I've got various websites. tradgames.org.uk is my sort of general informational website. I think I've got my email on there listed. Yeah, I have. And there's also gamesboard.org.uk, which is a website we set up as a group. There's a group called the Games Board, who are a group of collectors. And if you have a look on that website, you will see some amazing old games from some amazing collectors who've been collecting all their lives. And some of the stuff they have is astonishing. And I think you could email that as well if you want to email just general collection information. But yeah, or if you want to email you, obviously you could forward the email on to me too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that we would be happy to pass along your information to anybody, since you all know how to contact us here at the Fieldhouse Museum. So we could get you guys in contact with him. There is another one from Jason. It says in the 1870s book, The Modern Playmate, it says that the 2 differences between German billiards and Kakamaru is the number of balls. And that German billiards uses a spring. Have you heard anything like that with the spring in relation to German billiards before the Redgrave patent?
I have come across the spring before the Redgrave patent, yes. I can't remember where now, but in my own mind, I'm clear that Redgrave did not invent it. He only patented it. And I think he saw it probably, because he was English, he came across kind of in late 1860s, I think. And I think he got the idea from what he'd seen in England and then came across and used it in America. And but I can't recall where I've seen it before. But yeah, I mean, that's useful to know. If any reference like that's very useful and helpful.
Okay, so another question from Caitlin, and I am not German, nor do I speak German, so I'm just going to say the German Museum, did they confirm if their quizzical multi-game table has springs for the plunger or not?
No, I asked them several questions. They were kind of helpful. They sent me quite a lengthy email in response, which answered a lot of the questions, but unfortunately not some of the critical ones like that. And then my subsequent emails to them haven't been responded to yet. So I even asked if I could go to Berlin and sort of survey the table, because I think it could be so important that someone needs to look at it properly. So no, I haven't got that information. Oh, actually, that's not true. You can see in the picture that there is, we don't need them to confirm, because you can see in the picture that there's a sort of plunger. It's not a normal plunger though. I wonder if I can take you back to the picture. Oh, am I still showing the screen?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you look very carefully, bottom right, you can see there is a device for propelling the ball. It's not a sprung device. It is a piece of metal that has been stuck to the back of the table there, and then you can pull it back and let it go. So it is a sprung plunger. It's just not done with a curled spring. It's done with a springy piece of metal.
We also have a comment from Dale. He says, awesome talk. Thank you. Very interested in the topic and was glad that you addressed the split between traditional 9-cup and the tilted pin Bagatelle, which had been vexing in his research. So
me too, for decades. Yes.
And then Wayne asks, do you have any folk art Bagatelle in the UK?
What does that really mean, folk art Bagatelle?
I'm not sure. So and maybe I'll have him, Wayne, if you're still on, let's do a little further clarification.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, James.
Hi.
Wayne Morgan in Southern Ontario.
Yeah, we've communicated in the past, I think.
When I say folk art, it's a general term. Now, I'm sorry. A general term for, it's often in terms of visual art. And I've found a few, but it basically means self-taught.
Self-taught, so people just making art out of the Bagatelle, or people drawing on the Bagatelle? Well,
it's just that I found, say, in Northern Ontario, around Sudbury, where there are Franco-Ontarians, I found some wooden traditional Bagatelle games made for family and friends.
Oh.
And by cottage, I mean little things thrown together out of available materials to make a little bit of money on the side.
Now I'm with you. Yeah, so basically homemade Bagatelles, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, sold in the neighborhood or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think some in my collection would probably classify as that. Just to like, you know, 2, 3 maybe. I'm not sure if I showed any of them.
We have a 4th item here in Canada called Vetcraft. We had a federal program to help wounded soldiers between World War I and World War II to make games and toys and products. And one of them turned out to be a nice little Bagatelle game.
Oh.
Well, just simply painted, and that was it. But I would like to tell you that just a brief aside, that in Canada and in North America, but it was a Canadian product, we had table hockey. Do you ever hear that?
I've seen table hockey games of
very big in the 50s.
Yeah.
Every boy had one in North America. But I happened to speak to the son of the man who built them and designed them. And what he did was he took 2 Bagatelle games of the day in the 1930s, put them together because his game needed an elevation at the middle. And so this extremely popular game in my youth came from Bagatelles put together and created a 3rd game.
Interesting. So you've got a whole little sub area of research. You could walk down there. That sounds great.
Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Wayne. We have one here in person, a question.
Yes, I would like to know if you would consider the types of games that I recall as a child that was handheld, where you would tilt it to have the little balls pop into little holes. Like I remember there was a Halloween little Bagatelle or a little game where you worked hard to get these balls into the black cat's eyes and into the witch's eyes and things.
Yeah,
like that.
I mean, I know what you mean.
Is that a Bagatelle? No.
I've got 1 or 2 of those somewhere. There are a variety of them. There are there are little maze games, for instance, that could in the same genre of game. And I've seen games where, yeah, you have to wiggle a ball and go down what looks like a pin field. So often at first glance, they look like bagatelles. I wouldn't really call that a bagatelle. It's not the same game. So there was one made by the firm Jakes, where you had two very long, thin boards with all these pins, and it was a race. Each person had one of the boards and they had to race the ball right to the bottom as quick as they can through this pin field. And again, they look like bagatelles at first glance, but then they're not.
Yeah, the dexterity games, yeah. Ethan asked, what are the big remaining questions that you want to have answered in this research of Bagatelle?
Okay, good question. I think I would love to know more about this table that's on the screen there now. We really need to nail down the French connection. And so I've got these books I've got to translate and see if there's anything there. I believe that there was a game called Chinese billiards, or in French, billard chinois. And that may be the key to it, because I think that game was in France before 1850, and that maybe that's what they were playing and that's what they called it. So we need to look into that. Apart from that, I mean, it would be nice to know why 9-cup bagatelle suddenly appeared in England at the beginning of the 1800s, as if by magic. It's a bit of a mystery, that one. Beyond that, there are various things you could look at in the 20th century. I like going to the origins of games, but there's a lot more information in the 20th and late 19th century to go on. So people who are interested in analysing large amounts of data and working out how stuff happened, there's a whole wealth of research to be done there.
Wonderful. Malcolm asks, I think this is our last question on here. Malcolm asks, what distinguishes Tivoli?
Right, so Tivoli, a bit like Russian billiards, is a name that is attributed to all manner of games. So Tivoli can just mean bagatelle. It can mean there's another game from Italy, I think, where it was a billiards type of game with little skittles that stood up. That was called Tivoli. There are at least 4 or 5 games that are called Tivoli, and they're not all necessarily even similar. They're quite different games, some of them. So there is a game called Tivoli that, and a 20th century manufacturers produced a game called Tivoli, which is just a type of bagatelle. So in that respect, no difference. But in other respects, quite different.
Well, we did have one last question here. It looks like, or a couple more. And if you guys do have any more questions afterwards, we can pass them along to James and he can answer them personally too for you. Caitlin says in Finland had a game called Fortuna and often claimed credit for the toy pin bagatelle innovation as a precursor to the Cornithian company. Have you found any evidence of Fortuna influence outside of their games that were imported to Japan?
No, that is an interesting one. And Caitlin is probably far more qualified to find out the answer to it than I am, as I well know. But yeah, I mean, we could certainly look into it, can't we?
Yeah. And then Philip from Malta says baffle ball. You guys are just big words, people, and I apologize for my commonness. Baffle ball by Gottlieb.
Gottlieb, yeah.
Yes, is considered the first pinball. What distinguishes pinball from bagatelle?
Oh, well, that's a good question. That's like asking what is a game? It's one of those things that you can have whole nights of arguments about if you like. So probably best not to get too deeply into it. But personally, I think, and I'm sure everyone's going to disagree with this, I think pinball should be a coin-op thing, and it should have flippers and a glass top. And that for me is pinball. And that's different to bagatelle because most of the bagatelle games you've seen here are not coin-op and they're not, you know, modern electronic games with slippers. So that's, I think that the flipper is the distinguishing thing for me anyway. A lot of people would disagree with that.
Wonderful. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you for all the great questions. Thank you, James, for all the great research and letting us know about Bagatelle. We got lots of claps and ovations online, just so you know. And and if you guys are in the St. Louis area, come down, come see our great exhibit on Bagatelle. It's a private collection that we have here until the end of the year. And you actually get to play a couple of them as well. And for those researchers, if you're looking for something in particular, let us know. We might have one here on display. So thank you everybody for joining us today. Like I said, if there's any follow-up, just let us know. Yes, and our collection here is Mr. Ed Nichols' collection at the Fieldhouse Museum. So we actually have about a third to a half of what he has in his collection. So hopefully there's more to share with you guys as well. He will be giving a few tours. So we'll have a few tours by the collector, with the collector coming up in the next couple months. So those are great. There's only 3 of them scheduled. So make sure to sign up on Eventbrite. Oh, and Ed will be doing a presentation just like James here. So keep a lookout for those coming on our social media and Eventbrite pages. So